Good evening, and welcome back to Lullaby Historian. Before we begin tonight's story, take a moment to settle in. Pull the blanket close, breathe in the warmth of the room, and let your thoughts slow. Tonight, we'll travel far back in time to the edge of a new world, when gratitude was not yet a holiday, but a hard-won act of survival. And as you listen, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Share it down in the comments. Our little circle of light spans continents and time zones, joined by the same curiosity that brought people together centuries ago. And of course, if you'd like more journeys into the hidden corners of Lullaby Historian, be sure to subscribe. Each story opens a window into how we came to celebrate and why we remember. Now, close your eyes if you'd like, and visualize this.
The Crucible of the Continent, a Saga of American Destiny, Part 2. The Crossing, Ice, Mist, and Fear. Silas undertook his crossing of the Delaware not in a grand historical moment, but in a small, leaking rowboat at the hour before midnight. The river was a chaotic maze of black water and grinding ice flows. The crossing was brutal, the freezing spray turning instantly to ice on his thick woolen coat. He landed on the New Jersey side near Trenton, a town now occupied primarily by professional Hessian mercenaries, German soldiers feared for their discipline and perceived ruthlessness. His disguise was simple, a weary, hard-working free black man seeking employment delivering supplies to the occupying forces, a service the British often relied upon for logistics. The first test came upon entering the Hessian camp outside Trenton. The Hessian guards were wary, speaking little English, but they understood the language of necessity. Silas's legitimate cart and his willingness to work for poor pay smoothed his path. Behind enemy lines, the shadow network. Once inside the occupied territory, Silas activated his true network, the scattered, silent community of enslaved, indentured, and marginalized people who lived within the British strongholds. He communicated not through grand speeches, but through simple tasks and shared labor. In the kitchens, the stables, and the laundry lines, he found men and women who were eager to share what they knew. From a stable hand, he learned the exact number of horses and the location of the Hessian cavalry reserves outside the main Trenton camp, information vital for a surprise attack. From a laundress, he discovered the abysmal morale of the Hessian troops. They were tired, cold, felt unappreciated by their British allies, and were primarily focused on celebrating Christmas, neglecting their defensive posts. The laundress revealed a critical detail. The Hessians habitually left their forward defensive lines sparsely manned on the evenings immediately preceding major holidays. From a cook in a loyalist household, he learned the critical position of the main British supply depot in New York City and the routes being used for the winter shipment of provisions from the harbor. This confirmed that the British commanders, confident in the winter truce, were spread thin and complacent. Silas did not just gather facts, he sought the emotional texture of the enemy. He saw that the Hessians' commitment was transactional, while the British officers' commitment was arrogant. Both were weaknesses that Washington could exploit. The test of principle, the bondage of liberty. The most profound challenge of his mission came in a small loyalist farmhouse on the outskirts of Princeton, where he was tasked with delivering fodder. There he met Esther, a young enslaved woman who worked as the main house servant. Esther, upon recognizing Silas as a free man, risked everything to share her desperate need. She revealed that the Loyalist family was preparing to move north to Canada in the spring, and they intended to sell her and her young son to a plantation owner in the Deep South, a fate worse than death. She begged Silas to help her escape. This was the crisis of his dual mission. His loyalty to the Continental Army demanded a quick return with the intelligence. His aspiration for universal freedom demanded he act on Esther's plea. To help her would risk the intelligence and his own life. To abandon her would be to betray the very principle he was fighting for. Silas made a gut-wrenching decision. He could not risk immediate extraction, but he could prepare the way. He spent a precious, dangerous hour sketching a rough map of the area surrounding the farm, the hidden trails, the location of the few sympathetic Quaker houses, and the patrol routes. He gave Esther a coded message and a small supply of food, instructing her to wait for his return signal after the coming military action. "You must wait for the chaos, Esther," Silas whispered, his face etched with anxiety. "The moment the lines break, you run. I will send a message, but if I do not return, you must follow this map and trust the Quakers." Leaving Esther and her son behind was the hardest act of his life. He carried not just the wax-covered intelligence papers, but the heavy spiritual burden of her hope. His mission had proven that for him, the fight for liberty was not just about the king, but about the chains that still bound his people. Henry's shadow, the almost discovery. The danger escalated sharply during his return journey near New York. Henry Lathrop, now acting as a security advisor in General Howe's command, was patrolling the roads looking for any sign of Patriot infiltration. His humiliation in New Haven had made him cynical, paranoid, and ruthlessly efficient in spotting deceit. Silas was stopped by a British patrol led by Captain Lathrop himself. Henry dismounted, his face gaunt from the stress of retreat, but his eyes sharp. He recognized the free black carter instantly. "Jones, the printer's pressman. I recall you stated you were seeking honest labor. What business brings a patriot's friend so deep into His Majesty's lines in the dead of winter?" Silas maintained his persona perfectly, his demeanor humble and subservient. "Captain Lathrop, sir. I serve the needs of the supply lines. The Loyalists pay better than the rebels, and I need coin to survive the winter. Simple necessity, sir." Henry walked slowly around Silas's cart, his gaze lingering on the simple load of straw and firewood. He was looking for signs of a man playing a role, for arrogance beneath the humility. He suspected Silas was a spy, but he lacked any tangible proof. "You know the penalty for espionage, Jones," Henry warned, leaning close, his breath cold on Silas's ear. "If I find one piece of treasonous paper on your person, you will hang from the highest spar in the harbor, and your freedom will be sold to the highest bidder." Silas met his gaze for a moment, then respectfully lowered his eyes. "I understand the Crown's law, sir. I seek only the freedom of my own person, which I have lawfully purchased." Henry searched the cart and Silas's outer layers, but found nothing. He released Silas with a reluctant, chilling warning. "Do not return to this sector, Jones. Your association with that traitor Thorne is known. Survive the winter, for I guarantee you will not survive the spring." Silas drove on, his heart hammering against the secreted message. He had crossed the line and looked the enemy in the eye.
The return and the battle plan. Silas successfully made the crossing back over the icy Delaware and delivered his intelligence directly to Elias and the Continental Command. His information was immediately recognized as invaluable. The intelligence, the low morale of the Hessians, their focus on Christmas revelry, and their weak guard on Christmas night provided General Washington with the exact operational window he needed. Elias, listening to Silas's detailed report, was stunned by the depth of the information. "You have given us the advantage of surprise, Silas. This is better than 1,000 rifles."
Silas's physical ordeal was over, but his moral struggle was not. He immediately detailed Esther's plight to Elias. "We can win the battle, Major, but if we abandon the enslaved people caught in that fight, we lose the principle of the revolution," Silas argued passionately. Elias, now a man of both principle and pragmatism, nodded. "We will use this information to win, Silas, and when we strike Trenton, we will ensure that the ensuing chaos is the opportunity Esther needs. We must make sure this victory is not just for the colonists, but for the universal cause you fight for." The intelligence Silas gathered paved the way for the surprise attack on the Hessians in Trenton on the night of December 25th to 26th, 1776. It was a victory forged in secrecy, fueled by the sacrifices of an invisible agent, and driven by the deep personal conviction that true liberty had to extend to every soul caught in the brutal calculus of war. The Declaration, a promise etched in ink. The year 1776 was a time of violent contradictions. While the Continental Army endured devastating defeats in New York, losing battles and territory, the delegates in Philadelphia were engaged in the quieter yet infinitely more profound act of creation. The successes of men like Elias Thorne and Silas Jones, the strategic victory at Dorchester Heights, and the vital intelligence mission across the Delaware had secured the military space needed for this political birth. The long debate over separation culminated on July 2, 1776, when the Continental Congress voted to declare independence. 2 days later, on July 4th, the Declaration of Independence was formally adopted, a document penned primarily by Thomas Jefferson, articulating the philosophical foundations for a new republic. The arrival of the promise. News of the Declaration traveled slowly, delayed by the demands of war and the security concerns of the fledgling government. The official broadsides, the first copies of the Declaration, finally arrived in New Haven in mid-July. Amelia Vance, emerging from the strain of printing under siege, was the first to receive the crucial dispatch. It arrived not by military courier, but by a weary civilian writer who recognized Amelia's press as the true voice of the colony. Holding the thin, authoritative sheet of paper in her hands, Amelia felt a wave of dizzying relief and profound terror. The irreversible break with the crown was now etched in ink. They were no longer petitioning subjects. They were officially, unequivocally, traitors fighting for a sovereign nation. The punishment for treason was death. Her first act was to summon Silas. He had returned from his espionage mission, exhausted but alive, and was now organizing the Gazette's printing operation into a legitimate yet dedicated local newspaper once again, as New Haven was now free of direct British occupation. "Amelia," Silas said, laying the document on the printing table. "Look, it is done, the ultimate promise." Silas read the preamble slowly, letting the famous phrases resonate. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Silas's focus immediately narrowed on that phrase. All men are created equal. "Emilia," he whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "These are the most dangerous words ever written on this continent. If they mean this promise, truly mean it, then the revolution is just. If they do not, then the cause is still a hypocrisy." His commitment to the Declaration was contingent on its ultimate fulfillment. His aspiration for universal freedom had been granted a foundation in law, but that foundation was fragile and untested. Amelia, understanding the profound weight the words held for him, nodded. "The ink is on the page, Silas. Now the people must commit to the meaning. We must print this promise, and then we must read it to them, not as a law, but as a covenant." The public reading was a moment of profound hope. The reading of the Declaration was scheduled for the following afternoon in New Haven's town square, the very place where Elias had previously defended the press against Henry Lathrop. Amelia and Silas worked through the night, printing hundreds of copies. They chose the clearest, boldest type they possessed, ensuring the words would be unmistakable. This was their definitive act of treason, done in the light of day. The next day, a vast crowd gathered. They were not merely citizens, they were refugees from the siege, wives whose husbands were marching with the Continental Army, and laborers whose livelihoods had been crippled by the war. The atmosphere was a volatile mix of anxiety and defiance. Amelia chose not a politician or a magistrate to read the document, but the local militia leader, a man whose voice carried the authority of immediate sacrifice. The reading began with the dry recitation of the history of British injuries, but the mood shifted dramatically when the reader reached the immortal preamble. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." A profound silence fell over the square. People grasped the magnitude of the statement, not just the break with King George, but the radical assertion of human equality and popular sovereignty. When the reading was complete, the crowd erupted not in the chaotic shouting of a riot, but in a unified, sustained roar of affirmation. Hats flew into the air, bells rang across the city, and the former British crown insignia on the customs house was immediately torn down and publicly burned. It was a mass psychological commitment, the moment the people of New Haven collectively claimed their new identity as Americans. The women's struggle, Amelia and Silas. Back in New Haven, the news of the defeats had created a separate, yet equally acute sense of despair. Amelia Vance and Silas Jones struggled to maintain public morale against the relentless tide of bad news. The New Haven Gazette was running on fumes. The British blockade meant no proper rag paper could be imported, and Amelia was reduced to using salvaged scraps and the roughest colonial straw stock. The lack of reliable intelligence, compounded by the constant loyalist rumors of Washington's impending surrender, was killing the spirit of the citizens. "The words are losing their power, Amelia," Silas confessed one evening as they worked in the liberated yet struggling print shop. "The people need more than philosophy now. They need victory. The Loyalists claim Elias Thorne is either dead or preparing to desert with Washington." Amelia, despite the gnawing fear for Elias, fought back with her greatest weapon, unwavering conviction. She knew her paper could not afford to spread fear, only hope. She penned an editorial titled "The Winter of Our Resolve," deliberately echoing the defeats, but reframing them as a necessary trial. The Continental Army retreats across the snows of New Jersey, not in defeat, but in a strategic march of endurance. They are not running from the enemy. They are drawing the enemy deeper into the wilderness. The price of liberty is not a single battle. It is the courage to endure the long retreat. Let the king's men enjoy their warm beds and their stolen provisions. For every comfort they take, they surrender their principle. We endure hardship. They rely on comfort. And comfort, my countrymen, has never yet defeated conviction. Her words were powerful, but maintaining the press itself was a daily battle. The lack of provisions and money meant she could barely afford ink, let alone pay Silas and her few remaining workers. She was forced to sell off her last few inherited pieces of silver and fine china, the remnants of her old-world security, to buy basic supplies. The strain on their relationship was logistical rather than emotional. Silas, fiercely loyal to Amelia, was forced to use his network not only for intelligence, but to forage for food and sell his labor for coin to keep the press funded. His commitment to the cause required him to live perpetually on the edge of detection and destitution. He was fighting the American Revolution with scavenged ink and a promise of freedom. The lowest ebb. By December 1776, the Continental Army was reduced to its lowest ebb. The enlistments were expiring, and the war seemed lost. Washington's army was camped on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River, watching the confident Hessians celebrate Christmas in Trenton. Elias Thorne, surviving on sheer will and a ration of hard biscuit, felt the immense pressure of the entire cause resting on his exhausted shoulders. He had lost his yard, his apprentice's sight, and now his close comrade Jonah. The erosion of hope was complete. There was nothing left but raw, desperate necessity. It was into this atmosphere that Silas Jones completed his daring crossing behind enemy lines, bringing the crucial intelligence of the Hessian complacency. When Silas finally reached Elias, battered and near frozen, the sight of his loyal friend confirmed Elias's deepest conviction. The American cause was not lost, while men like Silas were willing to pay the ultimate price. Silas's intelligence, delivered in that bleakest of moments, was the final piece of the puzzle. It gave Washington the vital element of surprise and provided Elias with the one final task that could redeem the disastrous retreat: action. The long retreat had stripped away all illusions, all comforts, and but the most fundamental commitment. The army was decimated, but the core of leadership, Washington, Elias, and the intelligence network led by Amelia and Silas, remained fiercely committed. They had reached the bottom, and from the depths of their despair, they could finally strike back. The greatest victory was about to be born from the greatest defeat. Valley Forge, survival, and the soul of the army. The march of the Continental Army into Valley Forge in December 1777 was not a strategic move. It was a retreat into a crucible. After the devastating loss of Philadelphia to the British, George Washington's remaining forces settled onto the rugged, snow-dusted plateau in Pennsylvania. The camp was a landscape of despair, open to the harsh winter, devoid of supply, and rife with disease. Major Elias Thorne, having survived the brutal New York and New Jersey campaigns, now faced his greatest test. His military experience had taught him that the fight was not just against the British muskets, but against the insidious, relentless enemies of hunger, cold, and demoralization. The aspiration for a free nation had been stripped down to the basic, painful struggle for survival. The builder's trial, constructing discipline. Upon arrival, Washington gave Elias, along with his engineering team, the critical task: house the army. With nearly 12,000 men having no shelter but tattered, inadequate tents, Elias knew that unless proper wooden huts were erected before the deep snows, the entire force would dissolve. This required a level of organized construction wholly foreign to the exhausted, starving militia. Elias's loyalty to the cause compelled him to drive the men ruthlessly, applying the same principles of precision and hard labor he once used to build a perfect ship. He organized the troops into fatigue parties, felling trees, dragging heavy timber, and assembling the huts according to a standardized, methodical plan. "You may not be building a vessel, but you are building the primary weapon of this new nation, this army," Elias would roar, his voice strained but firm. "No slackening. Every house must be sound, every roof thick. This is your drill. This is your battle against the winter." Yet driving the men was agonizing. They were weak from insufficient rations, their feet wrapped in rags for lack of boots, their energy sapped by dysentery and exposure. Elias daily faced the conflict between his necessary military command and his civilian humanity. One frigid afternoon, Elias confronted Thomas, a young private, not his former apprentice, but a common soldier, whose hands were raw and whose axe stroke was weak. "Thomas, that wall is crooked," he stated, his tone flat. "If the snow kiles, this hut will collapse, and the men inside will freeze." Thomas let his axe fall into the slush, his face a mask of hunger and anger. "Major, have you tasted the fire cake? We have nothing. We aren't fighting. We are dying. You speak of discipline, but hunger knows no discipline. You were a builder of wood. Why can't you be a builder of men?" Thomas's accusation stung Elias deeply. He saw the truth in the soldier's eyes. These were not hardened regulars, but famished farmers and artisans. But Elias knew the truth of survival. If discipline and structure failed, everything failed. "I feel your pain, Thomas," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "But that wall is your life. If you don't build it strong now, the winter will claim you tomorrow. My duty is to ensure the endurance of this force. Now work. For every measure of work, I will share my own meager rations." Elias veiled his compassion with military necessity. His leadership was tested by the moral calculus of driving men to the point of collapse to save their lives. The mentor's arrival and the soul of the army. Amidst the extreme hardship, Elias found a vital mentor, Colonel Alastair Old Man Sterling. A seasoned veteran of the French and Indian War and one of Washington's most trusted advisors, Sterling was a stern but insightful man who understood that victory came from spirit, not just logistics. Sterling, recognizing Elias's raw ability, took the major under his wing. "Major Thorne," Colonel Sterling commented one night, watching the endless labor, "you understand masonry, but you do not understand why a man walks barefoot in the snow." "I drive them with the promise of liberty, Colonel," Elias replied, weary. "Liberty is an abstract concept when one's gut is empty. You are an artisan, and you build with wood, nail, and stone. But an army is built with pride and discipline. When a soldier is hungry, he needs not just bread, but dignity." Sterling taught Elias that the British viewed the Americans as an ill-disciplined mob. Elias's task was to turn that perception on its head. "You are not just building houses, Major. You are building their character. When they are well drilled, when they know they are part of an organized machine, their personal misery will lessen. That is the architecture of discipline. You are the artisan who creates the structural foundation of order." This profound insight reshaped Elias's approach, transitioning his role from pure engineering to psychological leadership. The lowest point and the moral sacrifice. As the winter deepened, Valley Forge became a literal hell. Food supply almost entirely ceased. The British blockade was effective, and the colonial currency was worthless. The camp descended into widespread sickness, theft, and devastating desertion. Elias's leadership was tested in the most painful ways. He was forced to implement increasingly harsh punishments to maintain order. One day he caught a soldier, a father of two, stealing a small portion of salt from the commissary, a highly valuable commodity. "Major, I cannot watch my body waste away," the man pleaded, tears freezing on his cheeks. "I am a soldier of the cause." Elias's shipwright's code of fairness fought against the brutal reality of command. He knew that if he allowed this, the entire commissary would be emptied within an hour. "You betray your comrades, and you betray the very army you swore to uphold." With a trembling heart, Elias enforced the harsh military justice of the time, a minor flogging and docking of pay. The act tore at his soul, but the enforcement of discipline was necessary to prevent the total breakdown of order. He understood that the price of liberty was not just paid in blood, but in the brutal, continuous sacrifice of personal human kindness for the sake of the collective survival. The mentor's sacrifice and the soul's renewal. The stagnation of the deep winter was violently broken in early March 1778. Elias and Colonel Sterling were escorting a small vital foraging party outside the perimeter, hoping to secure grain from a known sympathetic farm. They were ambushed by a detachment of loyalist raiders, likely commissioned by Henry Lathrop's network from New York, who were specifically targeting supply lines. Gunfire erupted from the tree line. Elias and Sterling scrambled for cover. Sterling, despite his age, moved with the speed of a predator. "Cover, Major," Sterling yelled, pulling Elias behind a thick oak. A moment later, a loyalist musket ball flew toward Elias. Before Elias could react, Sterling shoved Elias hard, throwing Elias behind the oak. The ball struck Sterling, not Elias, tearing into his shoulder and shattering his clavicle near the spine. Blood immediately soaked the snow. Elias dragged his mentor into cover. Sterling's face was pale, his breathing shallow, but a faint smile played on his lips. "Elias," Sterling whispered, his voice ravaged by pain, "I told you, dignity. The architecture of our discipline is built. Now you must reinforce it with the blood of perseverance. Remember, those who die this winter, they are the seed, and you are the harvest of liberty. Never yield." Minutes later, Colonel Sterling died in Elias's arms, a victim of the war's invisible enemy, the determined loyalist saboteur. The inheritance, leader of the soul. Colonel Sterling's death was a crushing personal blow to Elias. He had not only lost a mentor, but had witnessed the final, profound act of self-sacrifice that embodied the true spirit of the cause. Returning to camp with his mentor's body, Elias did not allow grief to consume him. Sterling's final words became his new mandate. Elias stood before his assembled men and relayed the story of Sterling's sacrifice, transforming the tragedy into a fierce, cold resolve. Elias was no longer merely the chief engineer. He had inherited the mantle of leader of the soul of the army. When Baron von Steuben arrived soon after, bringing the promise of Prussian training and discipline, Elias became his primary American counterpart. Elias ensured that every drill, every maneuver, and every new piece of protocol was understood not just as military technique, but as a commitment to the memory of sacrifice, a commitment to the dignity Sterling had preached. Elias Thorne, the man who yearned for the order of the shipyard, had been forged into an officer who understood that true leadership lay in enduring the hardship and commanding the soul of the army. The winter at Valley Forge had broken the body of the army, but Colonel Sterling's death and Elias's unwavering will had created the hard, disciplined core, the soul, that would eventually secure victory.
The Spy's Sacrifice, a whisper in the dark. By 1778, the war had entered a phase of brutal, protracted attrition. Following the strategic victory at Saratoga and the crucial French alliance, the British forces had largely consolidated in New York City, turning it into the heavily fortified heart of Loyalist power. General Washington's army, though trained and hardened at Valley Forge, was still struggling for crucial military and financial intelligence. This need for intelligence brought Silas Jones back into the darkest theater of the conflict, the web of occupied New York. His previous missions had established him as a highly valuable yet entirely invisible asset. His freedom and unique position allowed him to move where white agents dared not tread, maintaining his cover as a free carter and laborer servicing wealthy Loyalist households. The crisis point was the Treasury plot. Silas's current mission was the most dangerous yet. Intelligence suggested that the British command, facing growing financial pressure, was preparing a massive, clandestine shipment of gold and silver, the entire contents of their colonial treasury, to be smuggled out of New York Harbor and sent back to London. This treasure was meant to prop up the Crown's war effort in Europe. If the Patriots could intercept the shipment, it would be a crippling blow to the British war machine. Silas, working through his network of dock workers and servants, discovered the critical details: the precise location of the Treasury vault, the scheduled date and time of the transfer, and the single, heavily guarded Loyalist schooner, the Monarch, tasked with the transport. The crisis point was not merely gathering the information, but delivering it. The British had recently cracked down fiercely on all communication lines, instituting random searches, increasing patrols on the waterways, and placing high bounties on anyone caught attempting to pass the military cordon at Kingsbridge. Silas knew he could not risk the known routes. He had to attempt a direct, single-person extraction of the intelligence, a journey across enemy-held Manhattan, and a dangerous nocturnal ferry crossing under the very guns of the British fleet. The shadow of the enemy, Henry Lathrop. Adding a terrifying personal dimension to the crisis was the renewed involvement of Captain Henry Lathrop. Henry, still deeply embittered by his military failures in New Haven and his subsequent humiliation in the retreat from Boston, had found his true calling as the head of the British counter-espionage and internal security in New York. His paranoia and intimate knowledge of the Patriot leadership made him ruthlessly effective. Henry had long suspected Silas. He could not prove the charge, but he knew the link between the honest Carter and the traitorous shipwright Elias Thorne. Henry had set up a complex, multi-layered trap. He had quietly released a subtly false piece of information regarding the location of the gold transfer, hoping to lure the Patriot spy into revealing himself. Silas, however, had gained his information from multiple independent sources and knew the discrepancy in the Loyalist rumor mill. He knew Henry was testing the waters. The final confrontation occurred not on a battlefield, but in the echoing courtyard of the old colonial treasury building, where Silas was working a legitimate job cleaning the stables. Henry, in full uniform, approached Silas, his face cold and triumphant. "Jones, you have been a busy man. I have been watching you. Your work is impeccable. Your humility, well played. But I am not my sister's magistrate. I am the king's hunter." "I am merely serving my master, Captain," Silas replied, his eyes fixed on the ground, performing his well-rehearsed subservience. "Indeed, and your true master will be tested tonight. We have discovered a plot. Some fool will attempt to pass through the Kingsbridge cordon tonight with treasonous papers. Tell me who it is, and I will ensure your permanent freedom."
Henry's words were a fishing expedition, but Silas knew he had been identified as the potential messenger. He had the true intelligence hidden, sewn into the lining of a spare, thick belt concealed beneath his clothing. The pressure was immense. He was one step from the gallows.
The sacrifice, a whisper in the dark. Silas left the stables and immediately put his escape plan into action. He knew he could not risk the Kingsbridge land route. His only chance was the river. He procured a small, battered fishing scow and rowed out onto the dark, choppy water of the East River, aiming for a small, isolated patriot post on the Long Island shore. He disguised the scow's lamp with a dark cloth, leaving only a faint, flickering red glow, the recognized signal of a simple night fisherman. The journey was a sensory nightmare. The water was freezing, the air thick with the smell of unwashed docks, and the river was patrolled by quick British cutters. Silas relied on his knowledge of the currents and the shadows cast by the large British warships anchored nearby. As he neared a patrolling cutter, the ship's officer demanded he stop. Silas feigned drunkenness, muttering about catching eels. Then, from the shore behind him, he heard the sharp, unmistakable sound of a pistol shot. It was followed by two more, and then shouting. British soldiers had clearly found and stopped a suspected messenger attempting to flee via the main road. Silas realized Henry's trap had worked on someone else, another patriot. One of Silas's own peripheral contacts, perhaps, had taken the false bait. The British were alerted, and the patrols would soon sweep the river. Silas made his life-altering choice. He had the critical intelligence sewn into his belt, but if he was captured now, Henry would not only hang him, but the intelligence would be lost forever, and the British treasury would sail to safety. The success of the war hinged on this information. He reached into his coat and with a quick, decisive movement, cut the belt away from his body. He opened the lining, removed the wax-covered parchment, and weighed it in his hand. He had no time to hide it properly. The British cutter was turning back toward him. His life-altering choice became his greatest sacrifice. He could not risk the knowledge being discovered. With a final, desperate look at the parchment, the final, detailed plans for the treasury heist, Silas placed the intelligence in his mouth and swallowed the wax-covered scroll whole. The taste of tallow and bitter ink filled his throat. It was a crude, agonizing act of defiance, ensuring that even if he was captured, the enemy would only have his body, not his knowledge. The British cutter reached his scow. They boarded and dragged Silas onto the deck. The officer, annoyed by the drunken fisherman, demanded his papers. Silas, feigning terror and choking on the crude parchment he had swallowed, could barely stand. "I found him stumbling, sir. Looks like a drunken dock worker scared out of his wits." The officer, seeing no hidden papers, no weapons, and only a miserable, shaking man who had clearly risked the river for some meager catch, threw him back into his scow with a contemptuous shove. "Get out of here, you fool. If I see you again, I'll have you pressed into the fleet." Silas rowed on, tears streaming from his eyes, tears of relief, pain, and the bitter humiliation of having to act the beaten fool to survive. He had evaded Henry Lathrop, but the psychological toll was immense. He was alive, the intelligence was secure inside him, but he had sacrificed his dignity and nearly his life. The whisper of redemption. Silas reached the Patriot post on Long Island, collapsing onto the shore. The militiamen, seeing the shivering, wretched state of the free carter, were horrified. They tended to his physical needs, but when they asked for the intelligence, Silas could only shake his head. He could not speak. The swallowed parchment and the raw exposure had seized his throat. He had to convey the highly complex intelligence to the Patriot commander before the treasury ship, the Monarch, sailed. Silas summoned all his inner strength and the profound will forged by his aspiration for universal freedom,
pointed a shaking finger at a piece of charcoal and a slate. With painstaking effort, his hand trembling, Silas began to scratch the details into the slate: the date, the time, the true location of the transfer, and the name of the ship. Each stroke was an act of profound will, a whisper of information drawn from the deepest part of his being. He finally finished the last detail and collapsed again, utterly spent. The message was delivered. The Patriot commander looked at the crude slate, then at the exhausted, silent man, and understood the immense, terrifying act of sacrifice that had just taken place.
The diplomatic battle, Amelia and the financier. In New Haven, which now served as a vital coastal communication and provisioning center, Amelia Vance faced her own French challenge. While Elias dealt with the military aristocracy, Amelia dealt with the financial bureaucracy. She was introduced to Monsieur Antoine Dubois, a meticulous, aging French financier sent to oversee the judicious distribution of French gold to the fledgling American states. Dubois was precise, skeptical, and terrified of colonial incompetence. He viewed Amelia's newspaper as a frivolous expense in a country that desperately needed boots and powder. Amelia needed French funding to expand the Gazette's distribution and, crucially, to purchase quality rag paper, a rare commodity vital for printing the new nation's official documents and ensuring clarity of propaganda. "Mademoiselle Vance," Dubois said, reviewing her ledgers with distaste, "you request gold for paper? My instructions are for arms. Guns win the war. Paper is merely the smoke that follows." "Monsieur Dubois," Amelia countered, her voice ringing with conviction, "you have bought us time and cannon. Now we must buy the soul of the people. The French king has recognized our independence, but the American people must be convinced of their unity. My paper, my ink, is the sinew that binds this union. If the people cannot read the declaration and the promise of their new government, the alliance of gold is wasted on a nation that collapses from within." Amelia's passion, her American grit, slowly wore down Dubois' European cynicism. He realized that the American cause was driven by a powerful, articulated ideology that needed dissemination. Dubois, accustomed to the top-down obedience of the monarchy, was forced to confront the messy, bottom-up necessity of public opinion in a republic. Amelia secured her funding, but not before agreeing to print the Gazette in a bilingual format, ensuring the French allies understood the American political discourse. This new political dynamic meant Amelia's words now had to serve not only the cause of liberty, but also the delicate dance of international diplomacy. Silas's new role: bridging the cultural divide. Silas Jones, recovering from his espionage ordeal, found himself the most unlikely cultural bridge between the Americans and the French. He was detailed by Elias to serve as a high-value interpreter and liaison, primarily because of his acute observational skills, multilingual ear — he had picked up pidgin French from sailors — and his quiet professionalism. The French, many of whom came from the cosmopolitan slave-holding colonies in the Caribbean, did not immediately grasp the complexity of American slavery and the unique status of free black men like Silas. Many treated Silas with condescension that bordered on disdain, confusing his quiet reserve with servitude. One evening, while interpreting a logistical plan between a French artillery colonel and an American major, the colonel turned to Silas. "Fetch us the claret, garçon." Silas paused, meeting the Frenchman's eye. "I am the major's liaison and interpreter, Colonel. I do not fetch wine, but I can fetch the map of the coastal route you requested." The Frenchman was stunned by the defiance. The American major, realizing the cultural clash, quickly intervened. Later, Lafayette, having observed the exchange, sought out Silas. "Monsieur Jones," the Lafayette said quietly, "you are not like the laborers of the Antilles. You speak of liberty with the major's fervor, yet you are black." Silas, seizing the moment, spoke not of his own freedom, but of the contradiction in the alliance. Marquis, the principles of all men are created equal were written in America, but the philosophy began in the salons of France. You fight for the American ideal, but you hold a different one in your own colonies. My fight is not just for the defeat of the English king, but for the universal truth written in our Declaration. If your country is truly our ally in liberty, that liberty must know no color. Lafayette was deeply moved. The conversation forced the young idealist to confront the fundamental hypocrisy of the French monarchy supporting a revolution based on universal rights. Silas's aspiration for universal freedom had reached the ears of the most influential French ally, planting a seed that would later grow into the French Revolution itself. Silas's new role was to be the conscience of the Foreign Alliance.
The final coordination, planning the end. The cultural and logistical integration was slow but effective. By 1780, the combined forces achieved a new level of professionalism. The Foreign Alliance meant the war was no longer an internal colonial rebellion. It was a global military operation. Elias, working with French engineers, utilized new siege techniques and learned to appreciate the French flair for large-scale operations. Amelia's presses churned out French-funded propaganda that detailed the strength of the alliance and urged loyalists to renounce their cause. Silas's network became invaluable for coordinating the movement of the Allied forces. The stage was set for the final decisive action. The French fleet's commitment to the American coast was the final, indispensable piece of the puzzle. Elias knew that if the French could block the British escape routes by sea, the American army could finally corner and defeat a major British force on land. The political dynamics of the alliance, the clash between French finery and American grit, were ultimately resolved by the shared, singular objective, the final, crushing defeat of the British Army. The Americans had provided the initial courage. The French provided the final, necessary instruments of victory. The long struggle, defined by internal hardship, was now moving toward its inevitable, climactic end. The Benedict Arnold problem, a traitor's shadow. The year 1780 was one of immense strategic frustration for the Continental Army. Despite the crucial French alliance, the war dragged on, punctuated by exhausting skirmishes and the constant threat of financial collapse. Amid this grinding attrition, the Patriot cause was suddenly struck by a blow far more devastating than any military defeat: the betrayal of Benedict Arnold. Arnold, who had once been hailed as one of the Revolution's most brilliant field commanders, was revealed in September 1780 to be a spy for the British. He had attempted to surrender the vital American fort at West Point, the key to controlling the Hudson River, to the enemy. The revelation of his treachery sent a shockwave of despair and furious indignation through the American ranks, creating a profound emotional impact of treachery that threatened to undermine the very soul of the army. The architects' shattered faith. Major Elias Forn, who had endured the carnage of the long retreat and the freezing hell of Valley Forge, felt the betrayal with a crippling intensity that transcended military strategy. Elias had been intimately familiar with Arnold. He had worked alongside the general during the seizure of Ticonderoga, and he knew the sheer military prowess Arnold possessed. He saw Arnold as a soldier who had bled for the cause. His brilliance had been a source of immense pride. The realization that such a man could turn coat, not due to military failure or lack of supplies, but due to personal ambition, resentment, and greed, shattered his faith in the moral purity of the revolution. He was sitting in his meager tent, reviewing plans for a new magazine when the news arrived. A terse official order from General Washington himself, confirming the treason and demanding immediate vigilance against similar plots. Elias slammed his fist onto the rough wooden table. The sound echoed the fury in his heart. Treason. Not merely desertion, but a calculated, deliberate plot to surrender thousands of men and the most critical stronghold on the continent. Elias sought out his remaining trusted confidant, a grizzled old engineer who had served under him since Ticonderoga. We lost Fort Washington. We lost New York. We lost blood and limb. Elias growled, his voice tight with controlled rage. We lost Colonel Sterling to a musket ball, but those were acts of war. This is a cancer, a rot from within. If a man who bled for us can betray us, who is left to trust? Arnold's treason forced Elias to confront the dark underbelly of human nature. His personal view of command was fundamentally altered. Before Arnold, Elias believed that a man who committed his life to a cause, who shared the suffering, was fundamentally incorruptible. Now he realized that ambition and entitlement could be more destructive than any bullet. The command crisis, distrust and vigilance. Arnold's defection immediately created a crisis of distrust within the officer corps. Washington, himself deeply shaken by the treachery of a man he had trusted completely, ordered a massive internal security sweep. Elias's new, painful duty was to audit and re-vet every one of his engineering officers and logistics quartermasters, the very men who controlled the movement of the Army's most sensitive resources. His personal view of command now shifted from trust based on shared suffering to vigilance based on potential self-interest. Elias became meticulous, almost obsessive in his record-keeping and inspections. He scrutinized supply requisitions, troop placements, and communication lines, constantly looking for the small, arrogant signs of self-importance and hidden resentments that had characterized Arnold's later years. He realized that Arnold's actions demanded a new kind of leader, one who was not only brave in battle, but morally impeccable in conduct. Elias's new command principle: we must fight the enemy without the fort, but we must purge the ambition within the camp. Discipline is now the armor of the soul, not just the body.
This shift required him to distance himself emotionally from his subordinates. The shared camaraderie of the forge was replaced by the cold, necessary scrutiny of the security audit. His role was no longer just to build defenses, but to build moral firewalls against future treachery. The Loyalists' goad, Henry's vile triumph. For Captain Henry Lathrop, Benedict Arnold's treason was the single greatest triumph of the war, a profound vindication of his loyalist ideology. Arnold's defection proved Henry's long-held belief that the American cause was nothing more than a chaotic movement driven by ambition, and that its leaders, when tested, would inevitably return to the stable order of the crown. Henry, still in New York security, played a direct role in debriefing the British agent involved in the plot, Major John Andre. Though the plot ultimately failed, Henry felt a malicious sense of victory. He immediately ordered the printing of thousands of broadsides, penned by loyalist propagandists, that focused solely on Arnold's treason. These were smuggled into Patriot-held territories, including New Haven. The Loyalist propaganda was relentless and cruel. It presented Arnold as the only true patriot who finally realized the futility and corruption of the rebellion, casting Washington as a weak commander and the Continental Congress as a collection of petty thieves.
The clear goal was to sow maximum emotional confusion and despair among the American populace. Henry, in his private correspondence to his sister Eleanor, gloated openly, quote, "The serpent has eaten its own tail. Thorne's noble little rebellion is revealed for what it is, a contest of ego. Arnold's price proves that every rebel has his price. When we hang him in effigy, we hang the entire concept of their false liberty." The tragedy of Arnold's treason allowed Henry to believe that his own actions, though costly and isolating, were justified by the inherent moral superiority of order over chaotic liberty. The press fights back. Amelia's defense of honor. In New Haven, Amelia Vance and Silas Jones immediately recognized that the traitor's shadow was a far greater threat than any British army movement. The Loyalist broadsides were poisonous, targeting the morale that Amelia had so painstakingly built over years. Amelia's response was not to deny the betrayal, but to directly confront the emotional impact of treachery. She understood that the people needed to process their fury and grief in a constructive way. She penned one of her most potent editorials, titled "The Honor That Remains," which was immediately printed and distributed, directly contradicting Henry's propaganda. Quote, "Yes, Benedict Arnold has stained the honor of our cause with the blackest treason. He has exchanged the glory of a patriot for the silver of a mercenary. But let us look not at the one man who failed, but at the thousands who remain. The one who betrays us proves the strength of the 10,000 who stand fast. We do not fight for one general's ambition. We fight for the sacred promise of the Declaration. Arnold's name shall be forever synonymous with shame, while the name of the common soldier who endures hardship without complaint shall be etched in the marble of our liberty. We grieve the betrayal, but we affirm the cause." Silas was instrumental in distributing this message, using his network to deliver it specifically into the camps and towns most affected by the Loyalist rumors. His experience with his own personal sacrifice, swallowing the intelligence, made him an expert in understanding the internal cost of loyalty. He focused not just on distribution, but on having the editorial read aloud, ensuring the message penetrated the despair. The press successfully managed the crisis, guiding the public's overwhelming anger away from despair and towards a fierce, unified reaffirmation of principle. The scar of suspicion. Arnold's treason ultimately failed to destroy the Patriot cause, thanks to the swift damage control by Washington and the strong moral counter-propaganda by Amelia. However, it left a permanent, invisible scar on the army. When Elias and Amelia finally communicated after the crisis, their shared sense of violation was clear. "The work is harder now, Elias," Amelia wrote. "We have to fight the external enemy while never knowing who sleeps in the tent beside us." Elias replied with a somber confession, "I build the defenses, but my heart is heavy with suspicion. I have lost the simple trust I once had in the virtue of shared suffering. Arnold taught me that the enemy's greatest weapon is the desire of a man to serve his own greed. I will never command with the same innocence again." Arnold's betrayal solidified the difference between the two brothers. Henry was confirmed in his cynical belief that all men are motivated by self-interest and money, while Elias was forced to accept the dark truth of human frailty, yet ultimately chose to reaffirm the necessity of a higher, incorruptible principle. The traitor's shadow was long, but it could not extinguish the light of the cause.
The Southern Strategy, War in the Backcountry. The period spanning late 1780 and early 1781 marked a grim and fundamental change in the American Revolution. The British, frustrated by their inability to crush Washington's main army in the north and buoyed by the perceived Loyalist strength in the south, executed their new Southern strategy. The goal was to conquer the lower colonies, Georgia and the Carolinas, using local Loyalist militias, thereby isolating the rebellious North. The war that erupted in the vast backcountry was far removed from the formalized European-style conflicts of Boston and New York. This was a savage, deeply personal form of warfare, a desperate conflict of neighbor against neighbor, marked by unbridled guerrilla warfare and a horrifying lack of quarter. It became a crucible of extreme violence that tested the very moral foundations of the participants, leading to the moral descent of some characters due to the sheer brutality. Elias's crisis of faith, the collapse of order. Major Elias Thorne was ordered south to assist General Nathaniel Greene's depleted Continental forces, focused primarily on coordinating engineering and logistics. The shift from the disciplined struggle of Valley Forge to the chaotic, bloody reality of the South was a profound psychological shock. Here, there were no clear front lines. Small, deadly bands of patriot partisans like Francis Marion's Swamp Fox and Thomas Sumter's Gamecock clashed daily with equally vicious Loyalist militias. The lines between military and civilian life vanished. The farmer who offered food in the morning might be a vengeful raider by midnight. Elias witnessed brutality that dwarfed the suffering of the northern retreats. The sight of systematic destruction, homes burned, families displaced, and captives often tortured or executed on the spot, forced Elias to question the very nature of the liberty they were fighting for. The noble promise of the Declaration felt miles away from the smell of burning flesh and the sounds of constant petty retribution. Elias's commitment to discipline, forged in the hardship of Valley Forge, crumbled under the weight of this lawlessness. He saw that here, survival, not order, was the ultimate commander. One scouting mission led Elias to a small, isolated farm where a patriot militiaman had been executed by Loyalist raiders. The man had been tied to a tree and systematically mutilated. Elias was gripped by a cold, agonizing fury. He turned to a grizzled patriot partisan officer. "Why this brutality? This is not war, this is murder. We must maintain some shred of honor." The partisan spat on the ground. "Honor, Major? Honor is a dead language in the backcountry. That man was my cousin. If we do not make the Loyalists fear us more than they fear the crown, we lose everything. We fight fire with fire. You fight for a republic. We fight for our lives." Elias realized the truth of the statement. His assignment was to supply Greene's army, which relied heavily on these partisan bands for intelligence and harassment. Elias faced a moral dilemma. Supplying the partisans meant tacitly supporting their brutal methods, yet refusing meant the collapse of Greene's strategic advantage. His moral descent began with a silent, agonizing compromise. He continued to authorize the supply transfers. He rationalized that the ultimate noble goal of independence justified the means, no matter how barbaric. He consciously suppressed the humanist lessons of Valley Forge, understanding that to win this war, he had to sacrifice a piece of his own soul to the necessity of Southern ruthlessness. Henry's reign of terror, the vindication of cruelty. For Captain Henry Lathrop, the Southern campaign was not a descent, but a culmination. His long-festering resentment against the chaotic nature of the rebellion and his deep commitment to Loyalist order found its ultimate, brutal expression under the notorious British cavalry commander Banastre Tarleton. Henry was dispatched south to lead and organize the Loyalist militias, a position that gave him virtually unchecked power. He embraced Tarleton's no-quarter policy, believing that only total, annihilating terror could restore the rightful order of the crown.
The Southerners' intense personal grudges provided Henry with an eager, brutal instrument. Henry's moral compass failed entirely in the South. His actions moved from strict enforcement of the law to calculated, deliberate terrorism. He ordered the systematic destruction of Patriot-sympathizing communities, not just to deny supplies, but to break their will. In one small settlement known for harboring Marion's men, Henry received word that the villagers had refused to give up their Patriot neighbors. Henry ordered his militia to round up several suspected Patriot sympathizers, including elderly men and boys, and executed them in the town square.
"This rebellion is a disease," Henry declared to the trembling villagers, his voice devoid of emotion. "And a disease requires radical surgery. Every act of defiance will be met with tenfold retribution. Let the price of their so-called liberty be paid in the starvation of their families." Henry's loyalty to order had devolved into a monstrous justification for wanton cruelty. He found a strange, chilling vindication in the chaos. If the war was to be savage, then his side, the side of authority, must be the most savage of all. He believed that his extreme violence was the only rational path to restoring stability. He was no longer a man fighting for the king. He was a self-appointed executioner of chaos. Silas's dark choice, the calculus of survival. Silas Jones, serving as a critical intelligence coordinator for Greene's army, also found his moral resilience tested by the backcountry's moral darkness. His network, composed largely of enslaved and free black people seeking their own freedom, was particularly vulnerable to the extreme violence of the white militias on both sides. Silas's greatest challenge was the calculus of survival. He needed to protect his informants, many of whom were risking death for a chance at freedom, while simultaneously providing intelligence that would ensure the Patriot victory. He received information from an enslaved informant detailing the location of a highly sought-after Loyalist ambush party that had been responsible for the torture and murder of several Patriot supporters. The location was accurate, but the intelligence also revealed that catching the ambush party would inevitably lead to the capture of a key Loyalist sympathizer who had been providing Silas's informant with crucial cover. Silas faced a brutal choice: capture the murderous ambush party, but sacrifice his informant's cover and potentially his life, or let the murderers escape. Silas made a devastating, cold decision. He did not risk his informant. Instead, he leaked a modified version of the ambush party's location to Sumter's ruthless partisans. Silas knew that Sumter would not simply defeat the raiders, he would execute them immediately and brutally. Silas averted the capture of his informant and neutralized a dangerous enemy, but he did so by deliberately consigning men to a savage end outside the rule of law. This was Silas's darkest moral compromise. He had used the brutal logic of the Southern strategy, the immediate, savage execution of enemies, to protect his own network. He had not pulled the trigger, but he had orchestrated the end. His aspiration for universal freedom now carried the stain of necessary immorality. He knew that if freedom was bought by orchestrating such ends, the resulting nation would forever bear the spiritual scar of the price paid. The climax, the scars of the backcountry. The Southern campaign was a strategic success for the Patriots, culminating in decisive engagements at Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse. Yet the victories came at an immense spiritual price. When Elias witnessed the immediate aftermath of a partisan engagement where the victors showed no mercy to the captured, he knew he could no longer speak of the war with the same moral certitude. His hands were clean of blood, but his soul was stained by his complicity. The moral descent in the backcountry was a lasting wound. It taught Elias that the revolution would require a redemption far greater than any military victory. It would require the rebuilding of human morality shattered by indiscriminate violence. The Southern strategy confirmed Henry's belief that humanity was inherently cruel, justifying his own descent into terror. And for Silas, it revealed that the fight for freedom demanded choices so painful and morally ambiguous that the cost of survival could at times eclipse the joy of the promised liberty. The war had shifted. It was no longer a fight against an external power. It was a devastating internal war of the American soul, fought with American grit and backcountry ruthlessness. The Women's War, keeping the flame alive. By 1781, the war had become a battle of attrition. While the main armies maneuvered in the south, the home front, especially towns like New Haven, now vital for supply and communication, became the hidden, indispensable theater of the Women's War. With Elias Thorne in the field and the colonial government perpetually on the brink of collapse, the burden of maintaining civil society and supporting the war effort fell squarely upon the shoulders of the patriot women. Amelia Vance's role, born out of necessity and driven by her fierce conviction in the cause, expanded dramatically beyond the walls of her press shed. She had become the quiet civilian anchor of the revolution in New England, taking on responsibilities once handled by the men now fighting hundreds of miles away.
Beyond the press, the architect of relief. Amelia's first and most immediate new role was organizing relief and supply. The war had generated a massive refugee crisis, and the constant devaluation of continental currency meant that soldiers' families were destitute and wounded veterans were left to starve. Amelia recognized that moral was a logistical problem. If the families of the soldiers failed, the soldiers themselves would desert. She established the New Haven Relief and Benevolence Society, a civilian organization run entirely by women to tackle these issues. Her initial efforts were practical and aggressive. Organizing trade. Amelia used the financial credibility she had gained through the French alliance and her press to engage in managing trade. She brokered deals with local farmers and merchants, convincing them to accept scarce silver and French notes rather than worthless continental scrip. She then used this secure base to purchase essential commodities, grain, salt, and woolen cloth, bypassing the collapsing state supply system. The knitting circle. She transformed her printing shop into the central hub of a vast, town-wide effort. While the press ran below, the upstairs room became a massive, organized knitting and sewing operation. Women, including the wives of loyalists who quietly feared the collapse of order, contributed their labor. They produced thousands of pairs of mittens, stockings, and essential bandages for the Southern Army, often using homespun yarn that Amelia had negotiated for. She was, in essence, running a civilian quartermaster's office. Amelia's aspiration expanded from printing the laws of liberty to enacting the spirit of charity. She understood that the new republic was not just an idea etched in ink, but a community held together by mutual responsibility. The political lobbies, the fight for the cause's funding. The most difficult challenge was the near-total collapse of state finances. The Continental Congress was perpetually in debt, and state governments were often run by hesitant, conservative men who feared the instability of revolution. Amelia realized that the war would be lost not to the British, but to fiscal paralysis. She began a campaign of political lobbying that required immense personal courage and political acumen.
She traveled to the state capital, where she used her established reputation as the voice of the New Haven Gazette to gain access to the legislative chambers. She focused her efforts on the most urgent issue, securing a stable loan from wealthy merchants to replace the worthless Continental paper. Her approach was twofold: the press as leverage. She subtly reminded recalcitrant legislators that the Gazette had the power to shape public opinion and could expose those who prioritized their personal wealth over the war effort. The moral argument. She appealed to the merchants' long-term self-interest, arguing that a small, secure investment now would ensure the ultimate triumph of the Republic, and thus the stability of their future fortunes, while failure meant utter financial ruin and British retribution. In one highly charged private meeting with a powerful, skeptical committee of merchant legislators, Amelia dropped her usual professional restraint. "Gentlemen," she declared, her voice ringing with the authority of the suffering she had witnessed, "your sons bleed in the South, relying on the boots my women sew with their last threads. If you refuse this loan, you are not merely balancing a ledger, you are signing the death warrant of the Continental Army. Your gold is worthless in a world ruled by a vengeful King George. Your only true investment is in the Declaration, and that is paid for by courage, not cowardice." Her passionate, unyielding rhetoric, backed by practical facts and the looming threat of public exposure, succeeded. The committee reluctantly approved the necessary loan, a crucial, temporary injection of capital that allowed New England to meet its military quotas. Amelia had become an effective, unelected political agent for the Revolution. The shadow of Eleanor, the Loyalist counteroffensive. Amelia's expanded role brought her into sharper conflict with her old adversary and former friend, Eleanor Beaumont, Captain Henry Lathrop's sister. Eleanor, leveraging her position as the wife of a high-ranking Loyalist judge, saw Amelia's relief efforts not as charity, but as a direct, organized threat to Loyalist power. Eleanor was running her own smaller Loyalist relief society, ostensibly to aid the families of Loyalists who had fled to British-occupied New York. Her true purpose, however, was espionage and counter-propaganda. Eleanor used her society to gather intelligence. She collected information on the supplies Amelia was gathering, the routes the military used, and the names of the merchants who backed the Patriot loans. This was then secretly passed to Henry Lathrop's security network.
Undermine morale. She spread rumors that the Patriot-sewn garments were riddled with disease, a vile echo of the smallpox rumor, and that Amelia's funds were being mismanaged. The Women's War in New Haven was a civilized but vicious battle, waged through knitting needles and ledger hooks. It was a contest of wills between Amelia's active public commitment to a new republic and Eleanor's rigid, manipulative loyalty to the old order. Their conflict came to a head when Eleanor attempted to bribe a key merchant to pull out of Amelia's loan agreement. Amelia, armed with irrefutable proof of Eleanor's espionage and the subsequent transfer of intelligence to Henry, confronted her. Amelia did not expose her to the authorities, knowing the chaos it would cause, but she delivered a cold, final ultimatum. You cease your efforts to sabotage the relief and the loans, or I will use the power of the press to ensure you and your husband face the full, unsparing wrath of the people. I will not allow your petty spite to cost another soldier his life. This is no longer a personal quarrel, Eleanor. It is treason. Eleanor, realizing the immense power Amelia now wielded, a power rooted not in official title, but in the trust of the people, retreated. The civilian battle for New Haven was won by the sheer, overwhelming organizing force of Amelia Vance.
keeping the flame alive. By the time the news of the coordinated French and American march toward Yorktown arrived, Amelia had successfully transformed the Patriot cause in New Haven from a fragile political movement into a robust, self-sustaining civilian entity. She had proven that the Women's War was not secondary, but foundational. Her press kept the flame of principle alive. Her relief efforts sustained the body of the army, and her lobbying efforts secured the financial stability needed for the final push. Amelia had become the essential link between the ideas of the Declaration and the reality of survival. The success of the Southern campaign and the move toward a decisive battle were made possible not just by the grit of Elias's engineers and the sacrifice of Silas's spies, but by the relentless, organized labor of the women on the home front, led by the woman who was no longer just a printer, but a political force. Yorktown's final gambit, the last siege. The grand strategic move that defined the autumn of 1781 was a masterstroke of Franco-American cooperation. General George Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau executed a lightning-fast march south from New York, trapping General Lord Cornwallis's entire British army at Yorktown, Virginia. The ultimate key was the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse, which established an impenetrable naval blockade, ensuring no British help could reach the besieged army. The resulting siege of Yorktown, September 28th to October 19th, 1781, was the war's final, climactic act, a 3-week battle of engineering, artillery, and attrition that brought all the major characters together on the same bloody, confined stage. Elias fights, the architect of the siege. Major Elias Thorne, now an experienced combat engineer, arrived with the Allied army. His role was paramount. He was the chief American liaison working with the French engineers to design and construct the siege lines. The success of the operation hinged on rapidly digging the parallels, the trenches that would bring the heavy siege guns close enough to batter Cornwallis into submission. Elias fought, not with a musket, but with a spade and a transit. The pace was relentless, the ground was hard, and the British artillery fire was constant. Elias was everywhere, laying out the precise angles of the first parallel, shoring up trenches, and overseeing the construction of gabions, wicker baskets filled with earth, to protect the workers. His engineering prowess was fully realized here, blending the rough-hewn practicality of American construction with the sophisticated classical geometry of French siege warfare. The siege was a contest of construction, and Elias was determined that his work would not fail. The critical moment came on the night of October 14th, with the assault on redoubts 9 and 10. These two fortified positions were the final obstacles preventing the Allies from completing the second inner parallel and placing their cannons at point-blank range. Elias was tasked with leading a small contingent of sappers to clear the abattis, a barrier of sharpened branches, and create a breach for the American storming party, led by Alexander Hamilton. The assault was carried out in absolute silence, with unloaded muskets, relying on the cold steel of the bayonet. Elias, now stripped of his rank and carrying only a large trenching tool, crawled through the darkness. The air was thick with tension and the smell of damp earth. As he hacked at the abattis, a British sentry spotted the movement. A musket cracked, and the night dissolved into chaos. Elias sprang up, his large frame driving through the barrier. He was among the first Americans to enter the small dirt fort. He fought with the desperate fury born of Valley Forge and the moral stain of the Southern strategy, not for glory, but for finality. He knew every yard gained here meant the end of the bloodletting. He was a builder fighting to dismantle the enemy's last hope. he engaged a Hessian soldier in a brief, savage hand-to-hand fight, using his trenching tool as a club, striking with the determination of a man who had waited 7 years for this final moment of reckoning. The redoubt fell quickly, captured by sheer, overwhelming force. Elias stood on the parapet, sweat and grime caked on his face, watching the French storm Redoubt 9. The breach was made. The siege was won.
Henry defends the ghost of loyalty. Within the besieged town, Captain Henry Lathrop commanded a small, exhausted detachment of Loyalist militia and British regulars manning a forward battery position. He was the quintessential defender of a lost cause. Following his moral break with the British command, his unraveling loyalty, Henry was a ghost of his former self. He performed his duties with clinical precision, yet his spirit was hollow. He no longer believed the crown was just, but his rigid sense of honor forbade him from abandoning his post or defecting. He was trapped by his own ironclad code. From his position, Henry watched the Allies' disciplined, rapid approach. He recognized the geometric perfection of the French siege lines, and with a chilling recognition, saw the signature of his brother, Elias, in the speed and structural integrity of the American works. Elias, the builder, was now dismantling Henry's world. The relentless Allied bombardment, cannons firing day and night, was physically and psychologically crushing. The British fortifications were crumbling, and the town was slowly being reduced to rubble. Henry faced constant casualties and the overwhelming despair of his men. On the night of the Redoubt assault, Henry was in the trenches, witnessing the speed and ferocity of the American attack. He felt no anger, only a detached, mournful certainty. When the British attempted a desperate, final sortie, a counterattack to spike the Allied guns, Henry was ordered to lead a covering force. He knew the attack was futile, a final ceremonial waste of life, ordered by a commander, Cornwallis, who had already lost faith. Henry performed the duty, fighting through the dark in a daze. He fought without malice, merely as a mechanism of war. During the chaotic retreat back into the battered defenses, a shard of wood, splintered by a French cannonball, struck him hard in the head. He collapsed, concussed, and was dragged back into the lines by one of his few remaining loyal militiamen. He awoke hours later in a makeshift field hospital, a damp cellar, his head bandaged, his vision blurred. He had defended his post until he could no longer stand. He had kept his word, upholding the honor of the uniform even as the cause it represented was sinking beneath the relentless fire. His defense was not driven by hope, but the cold, desperate need to prove that his own moral choice, his refusal to commit treason against principle, was separate from the final outcome of the war. Silas observes, the master of the shadow. Silas Jones did not wear a uniform, nor did he carry a musket. He was perhaps the most crucial individual on the field during the siege. He arrived ahead of Washington's main force, blending seamlessly into the chaos of the vast logistical operation. Silas's role was to observe and coordinate intelligence, specifically to ensure the French and American commanders had real-time data on British troop movements, supply levels, and critically, Cornwallis's psychological state. He used his network of enslaved people who were working inside the British lines, forced labor digging trenches and serving officers, to glean minute details. They brought him reports on the dwindling supply of flour, the spiking rate of dysentery, and the increasing friction between Cornwallis and his second-in-command, General O'Hara. He relayed the information directly to Lafayette's aides.
His intelligence confirmed the exact timing and vulnerability of the British outer defenses, giving Washington the confidence to green-light the aggressive redoubt assaults. Silas's greatest tension came from the fact that he was working right on the edge of the battlefield, witnessing the suffering of both sides. He saw the bodies of the Hessian mercenaries, brave men fighting for a paycheck in a war they didn't understand. He saw the profound weariness of the American soldiers, who fought not only the British, but the ghosts of Valley Forge. On the night of the redoubt assault, Silas was hidden in a small forward observation post, using a field glass to track the movements. He felt the culmination of years of sacrifice, his own, Elias's, and Amelia's, riding on the success of that bayonet charge. As the triumphant cheers rose from the captured redoubts, Silas lowered his glass. He felt not joy, but a profound, weary satisfaction. He had orchestrated a piece of history. The freedom he had fought for was not an abstract ideal read from a pamphlet. It was the tangible result of a perfectly timed piece of intelligence delivered by a whisper in the dark. The final gambit. With the inner defenses breached, the bombardment became unbearable. The final desperate British attempts to break out or evacuate failed. On October 17, 1781, a single British officer and a drummer boy appeared on the parapet, bearing a white flag. The siege was over. Elias, recovering from the assault and now overseeing the collection of captured ordnance, felt an immense, shuddering release. The fight was done. He had survived. Henry, bandaged and weak in the cellar hospital, heard the trumpet call of parley. The sound was a definitive, crashing finality. His world had ended not with a heroic roar, but with a quiet, devastating whimper of surrender. Silas, watching from the periphery, saw the ragged dignity of the defeated British army as they marched out to surrender. He saw the new future, the French in their immaculate uniforms, the Americans in their patched coats, standing side by side, victorious. The main characters had converged. Elias fought for the structure of victory. Henry defended the ruin of a lost ideal, and Silas observed the intelligence that made the victory inevitable. Yorktown was not just the end of the war. It was the final devastating answer to the duel of ideals that had fractured the Lathrop family and shaped the American Republic.
The Treaty of Paris, a victory paid in blood. The British surrender at Yorktown in October 1781 was the military culmination of the American Revolution, but the official end of the war did not arrive until the signing of the Treaty of Paris in September 1783. The intervening 2 years were a period of suspended animation, a strange, emotionally draining interlude of peace talks, military stand-downs, and profound, exhausting uncertainty. The war had been won, but the realization slowly dawned upon the characters that winning the war was only the first step. The victory had been paid in blood, and now the immense, unprecedented challenge of building a viable nation from the ashes of conflict had begun. Elias's emotional exhaustion, the builder's new task. Major Elias Thorne was among the thousands of weary, relieved, and intensely practical men who remained on military duty during the long negotiation period. He was instrumental in managing the demobilization of the Continental Army and overseeing the disposal of military assets. The physical danger was gone, but the emotional exhaustion was profound. Elias felt the weight of 7 years of sacrifice, the loss of his shipyard, the death of Colonel Sterling, the necessary moral compromises of the Southern campaign, and the constant, gnawing fear for Amelia and Silas. The news of the Treaty of Paris arrived in New York in November 1783, confirming American sovereignty.
Elias received the news not with shouts of joy, but with a quiet, reflective sobriety. He finally resigned his commission, trading his major's uniform for the plain coat of a civilian. His return to New Haven was marked by a profound change in perspective. His primary aspiration, now that the fighting was over, shifted from military survival to political stability. Elias realized that the Republic was still just a fragile collection of competing interests. He knew his destiny was no longer in building ships, but in building the political infrastructure to support the fragile concept of union. He spoke to Amelia upon his return, not of love, but of duty. "The British are gone, Amelia, but the fight has just begun. We won the war against tyranny, but now we must win the peace against chaos. The states bicker, the soldiers are unpaid, and the promise of the Declaration is already forgotten in the clamor of self-interest. My new task is to build a nation worthy of the blood that was shed." The victory had been paid for with the lives of the common soldiers, and Elias was determined to ensure that their sacrifice was not cheapened by the subsequent political failures of the elites. Amelia's new focus, the unfinished ink. Amelia Wance greeted the news of the treaty with the same guarded pragmatism as Elias. The press immediately ran the news with bold headlines, but Amelia's accompanying editorial was sober. Her realization was stark. The Declaration had been written in 1776, the treaty in 1783, but the meaning of the Declaration remained unfinished ink. The treaty granted political freedom from Britain, but it did not grant social freedom to all Americans. Amelia's role quickly expanded to that of a political watchdog and advocate. With the cessation of hostilities, her focus shifted. Advocacy for the veterans, she used the Gazette to wage a relentless campaign for the prompt and fair payment of the Continental Army soldiers whose sacrifices were being ignored by the cash-strapped Congress. The question of freedom. She, alongside Silas, began to subtly but firmly challenge the hypocrisy of the new republic that enshrined liberty while maintaining slavery. Her editorials began to draw sharper distinctions between political independence and universal emancipation. Amelia's victory was paid for with her entire former life, her property, her security, and the simple future she once envisioned. She was now a public figure, a political force, and she knew her pen was the new nation's conscience. She understood that winning the war was merely the first step toward an ongoing moral revolution.
Silas's path, the price of emancipation. Silas Jones greeted the Treaty of Paris with a deep personal understanding of the cost of victory. He was officially a free man in a free nation, but he knew the battle for his people's liberty was fundamentally unresolved. The treaty itself contained a cruel irony. It did not guarantee the freedom of the enslaved people who had fought for the patriot cause, nor did it prevent the British from carrying away thousands of former American slaves to places like Nova Scotia and the West Indies, a final bitter act of war that underscored the profound complexity of the racial dynamic. Silas's realization was the most painful. The victory was a partial victory. He devoted himself to two immediate, interconnected tasks: documentation of sacrifice. He began meticulously compiling the stories of the enslaved and free black men who had served in the Continental Army and the spy network. He was determined to ensure their contribution, their blood payment, was recorded and could not be erased from the new nation's history. Founding the abolitionist societies, working with Northern Quakers and a few sympathetic white political leaders, Silas began the early, difficult work of organizing the first abolitionist societies. He understood that the battlefield had moved from Yorktown to the legislature,
and his weapon was now the power of undeniable truth. Silas's future was clear. He would hold the new republic accountable to its founding words, "All men are created equal." He was the first to realize that the true war for American ideals would be fought over the next century, and he would be one of its first, most determined soldiers. Henry's exile, the cost of loyalty. The signing of the Treaty of Paris sealed the final tragic fate of Henry Lathrop. The treaty included specific provisions for the treatment of loyalists, but the reality on the ground was harsh. Henry was categorized as a military enemy, and he was forced to join the mass exodus of loyalists who were leaving the newly independent United States. He was among the thousands who were evacuated by the remaining British fleet, sailing from New York Harbor. He was stripped of his property, which was confiscated by the Patriot government, and he was effectively exiled. His unwavering loyalty had cost him everything: his brother, his home, his reputation, and his future on the continent. Henry found his sister Eleanor waiting for him in London, a city that felt foreign and cold. Eleanor had suffered her own loss, but her rigid loyalty to order remained intact. She blamed the American chaos, not the crown's incompetence, for their ruin. Henry, however, was fundamentally changed. He had won the duel of ideals. He had preserved his moral conscience by refusing the crown's cruel orders, but he had lost the war and his home. His victory was paid in complete alienation. He saw Elias's work in the victorious America and recognized the terrible irony. Elias was now the one building order, while Henry was a refugee of the very order he had fought to defend. He accepted that he was the necessary, tragic casualty of the revolution, a man who chose law over chaos, only to find the law itself was corrupt. A new order. The Treaty of Paris was celebrated across the 13 states. Bonfires were lit, bells rang, and the flags of the new nation were flown proudly. But for Elias, Amelia, and Silas, the true weight of the victory paid in blood was the recognition that the end of the war was merely the beginning of the great American experiment. Elias had to pivot from demolishing British forts to building American constitutional principles. Amelia had to pivot from defending the press to using it as a weapon against internal corruption and social injustice. Silas had to pivot from escaping slavery to initiating the long, painful political and moral struggle for universal emancipation. The crucible of the revolution had forged these characters, hardening their resolve and defining their purpose. They had paid the price for liberty, and now they were determined to ensure the new nation was worthy of that sacrifice. The next fight, the fight for the soul of the Republic, had just begun.
That is where the true spirit of A Saga of American Destiny Part 2 rests. Not in grand feasts or legends, but in the quiet grace of gratitude itself. And as we close tonight's story, I want to thank you for being here, for listening, and for keeping these histories alive. If you've enjoyed this journey through time, consider subscribe, like, comment, and share, where we continue to explore the stories, traditions, and mysteries behind the celebrations that shape our world. Your support helps keep the lantern burning, illuminating the past so that its warmth can reach the present. Until next time, may your nights be peaceful, your hearths bright, and your heart filled with gratitude. And I pray for your success and abundance. Good night and happy holidays.